there is a future that we can design, and we can move into that design. It is not a question of life is just going to keep happening to you, right? That life doesn't have to happen to you. This is not hubris in like, well, we're going to change the future, or we can guess what it is. But we all know that there's a distinction between that. We know that the decisions we make today, our future is bound up in the decisions we make today, just as we recognize that where we sit today is intricately bound to decisions we made yesterday. And the future that we're seeking to see, what happens when we change our horizon from next week to next year, to 10 years from now, to 20 years from now, to a multi-generational broad perspective of how the choices we make create those opportunities for the future, how we make sure we're becoming more expansive, more sustainable, more equitable, stronger, more connected. Those are the kinds of things that involve affirmative choice, affirmative engagement. And these are choices. These are strategic choice points we can make. And the fact is, when we look all over the country, people are making those choice points. People are deciding that there's a future to be had and that they can engage with it and through it. And there are both short-term strategies, long-term strategies, midterm strategies that are acknowledging and recognizing the context that we operate in. And we know it's tough. But there will be a tomorrow. The question is, how do we occupy that tomorrow?
Welcome to Black Philanthropy, Our Stories, where each episode spotlights awesome Black and African American leaders committed to transforming lives and communities through philanthropy. These authentic conversations will inspire, challenge, and remind you you are not alone. Here's your host, award-winning writer, director, and founder of Simuel and Murray, Michelle Renee Jackson.
My name is Michelle Renee Jackson. I am so pleased to be with you today. Thank you for trusting me and trusting our guest today with your time on Black Philanthropy, Our Stories. We are delighted to have our guest today, Keesha Gaskins-Nathan, on our show today.
Thank you so much, Michelle, and I'm really excited to be here and be part of this discussion. My name, Keesha Gaskins-Nathan, and I serve as the director of the Democratic Practice Program for the United States with the Rockefeller Brothers Fund. Democratic practice means we examine these questions of how we intervene around our democratic systems and our democratic culture to advance a vital and inclusive democracy of the United States, with a really express intention around racial and gender justice and equity within our interventions.
How did you get into this work, Keesha?
My career has had kind of a cobblestone path. After graduating law school, I had the opportunity to clerk for the Minnesota Supreme Court, Justice Alan Page and Justice Joan Erickson Lancaster. And it was an amazing experience. And I went into the practice of law, working primarily on toxic torts and products liability law, and enjoyed that practice, enjoyed that work, but felt it wasn't fully what I was being called to do. During that time, I've been very active in my local NAACP, very active in community work with the local, in Minnesota at that time. It's the Democratic Farmer Labor Party, and I was active there as well. And I remember being at the gym one day with a colleague and, looking at her and be like, I can't believe God put me on this earth to save Walmart a few couple $100,000 every year. That can't be why I'm here. And I took a leap and shifted my avocation, which was working in the field, working with politics. I served as a legal redress chair for the North Dakota, South Dakota, and Minnesota chapter for the NAACP at the time, and said, what happens if I turn this work that I've been doing in my quote unquote spare time into like all of my time? And what does it mean to actually turn into that? And so after about eight or 9 years of doing that work, I was honored to take on the role as executive director of the Minnesota Women's Political Caucus. And there I spent my time leading an organization largely of volunteers, working on getting diverse Minnesota women appointed and elected to office. And did that for some time. I moved from there to the League of Women Voters, where I got to be the executive director of that organization, League of Women Voters Minnesota, for a number of years until I was recruited away from there to the Brennan Center for Justice in New York, where I was senior counsel in the democracy program there, and I ran the redistricting and representation program, as well as leading litigation around opposing voter ID, proof of citizenship laws, voter suppression work, and also did affirmative work, partnering with the states, doing technical assistance on advancing ballot access questions like early voting, mail-in ballots, and the other work that's done at the state level to ensure full and fair access to the ballot. And after spending years upon years in the field, legal work, working with volunteer organizations, and doing, I think all of the work that really matters in many ways, I was recruited to the Rockefeller Brothers Fund to lead the democratic practice program there, and that was about 11 years ago. And I've been there since.
Why is voting and advocacy for voting rights so important to you, Keesha?
In the United States, voting is how we express power. And power, using and understanding and leveraging power is how we change the lived experiences for people to improve conditions and to meet the promises of our democracy that have never been realized in this country. Is voting the only way? No. Is voting the only thing we support? Absolutely not. Do we recognize, however, that it is a formal system by way we express power, how people exercise it, and how it is the most direct way that that folks work to disenfranchise and to disconnect people from their powers by ultimately removing them from their ability to express that power in meaningful political ways.
When did you first realize that this was something that was valuable to you, that you wanted to be a part of this process of advocacy?
I remember my mother taking me when I was a very small child to Washington, D.C., to Boston, to all these places of historic American significance, we should say, in a very, very traditional and formal way. In addition to slave burial grounds, in addition to everything, like my mother's a teacher, and she felt it was really important not just to talk about the places, but to see them. And the thing that was embedded in me was that this country wasn't built for us, but it is my country, and it is our country. And so I don't know ever not feeling that way about it. I don't ever know a time where I was like, oh, this was for others, or, you know, this is what they do for them, not us, or anything like that. I always believed that it is the blood of Black folks that are in the soil of this country that built this country. And I've always, always, always believed that we have to have that power. We have to make that expression. We have to figure out what that is. And I think as I got older, I would engage in volunteer opportunities. I would do these things and became more and more convinced and wrapped around. And I think by the time I graduated from law school, and I was very fortunate to go to Northeastern University School of Law, which is an amazing public interest law school with many, many like-minded and amazing people. And you can see folks from there all over the United States doing incredible work, and really honored to be a part of that community. But really coming out of there being like, there are real defined ways to advocate and intervene in very important ways, whether it's strictly through the legal process, but actually looking at all the formal systems that have oftentimes been denied to all kinds of people, certainly Black people, but Native populations, new immigrant populations, new Americans in so many ways, and really deciding that that's unacceptable. And the work we have to do is to change that.
The way that I come into this space as a filmmaker, as an artist, to do Black Philanthropy, our stories, and to be a storyteller is ultimately to honor our enslaved ancestors. So I happily look through the lens of the world as someone who descends from enslaved people. We're Jacksons, we're Simuels, we're Murrays, we're Polks, we're Armisteads, all individuals who come from enslaved communities. And so, but our guests come from a range of communities within the African diaspora. And so I wondered if you could share a little bit about you and your own sense of how your family or how your people come into the U.S. or where your people are from.
So that's a funky question for me.
Why is it so funky?
Because, well, one, I'm adopted. So oftentimes people say, well, is that your real family or the whole thing? I'm like, I know the family. I know my family. But I point that out, I think, because some really do So in terms of my biological lineage, your guess is as good as mine. In terms of my familial lineage, my father's family, we can't trace it all the way back. I think back to maybe North Carolina, in a very traditional historic framework, in terms of coming through slavery, and then being part of the move north. And my family, and so much of my extended family now, is Massachusetts, the New England area, New York, and there's all kinds of various stories around, kind of that development. On my mother's side of the family, it's a little different. My grandfather and many of my cousins are members of the Wampanoag tribe, which is the land that is oftentimes familiar with Martha's Vineyard. And historic land on the vineyard. In addition to our family that looped through Canada, there's some suspicion that some of our family were British loyalists. And and they were, and so we have land in our family in Nova Scotia, going back and then re-immigrating back to the U.S., where a whole set of generations of our family reside in the Massachusetts area. So we're those northernmost Black folks that people don't talk about very much. That there's this notion that all Black folks were all from the South, and certainly one side of my family tells that story. But I have another side of the family that tells sort of a different story.
You talked a little bit about as well, Keesha, about your mom being a teacher. What did your mom teach?
Well, she was an elementary school teacher. So I guess in teacher language, that's a generalist.
Okay.
For I think like 15, 20 years. She then went back to school to become, to get her doctorate, her master's and her doctorate then in educational administration. And then she became a principal in a number of different school systems around the country, and ultimately became the associate superintendent for Minneapolis Public Schools for many, many years, and then moved east and actually went back to being a principal and retired from that after being a principal after many, many years. So my mother worked for a very, very long time through a whole number of roles, all in public education. She finished her role as a principal, and really proud to say that the school she was at increased test scores for their students, and was really one of the most celebrated schools in Delaware. And so it was a really, she had a long and storied career. She was always dedicated to students of color. She was always dedicated to her students. And I think the thing that struck me most, besides the fact that she always remembered the name of every single one of her students, no matter how large the school, no matter how large the place. You could go visit and she would remember all of them, but would still sometimes mix me up with my brother or the dog at home, where there were only three of us and it felt a little confusing. But when she was at work, she got it. She had it all. But towards the end, she went back to being a principal. And I was like, why do you want to go back to being a principal? You were superintendent, you were associate superintendent. Why do you want to be a principal? And she's like, I can just do the work. I can do the work. I can make the lives better for the people around me as a principal. We can build the culture of learning. We can work with the teachers. We can work with the students without all the politics, without all the other things. She's like, I don't want to go back to that. She's like, I want to go out the way I came in, working with students and making their lives better. And so that's my mom's career as an educator.
What's your mom's name?
Dr. Mabel Ethel Gaskins.
Ooh. What's your father's name?
Richard Gaskins.
What did your dad do?
My dad, he started out, he's what we would call like a corporate nomad. So he took us all over the country, migrating through different corporate opportunities. He started out, there's still old photos of this. He was the first Black bank teller in Lynn, Massachusetts, like the first Monday. And after that, he moved into corporate spaces where he worked in human resources, and he worked with an old company called Control Data. It doesn't exist anymore, but it was one of the big first computer companies. He then went and moved around with IBM, and and then towards the latter part of his career, became vice president of human resources for American Express for quite some time, and then went to Merck Pharmaceuticals and retired from there. And so now both my parents are living retired in Delaware.
Awesome. Are they living their best life? My mom just retired and she's living her best life every day.
Yes, they are.
Good, good. I will tell you that I have a connection to Lynn. When I first left Princeton Seminary, I moved to, with the plan that I would transfer to Harvard, but I left Princeton before I got into Harvard. So there's like this 6 months of purgatory that I lived in Massachusetts. And I lived in Lynn, City of Sin. You never go out the way you come in. So there you go. But your dad, he did get out.
Well, yes. Well, my whole family's in Lynn. My grandmother raised her whole family, lived in, and was in Essex nursing home. And until she passed away at 99. And, but my whole extended family, we still have people in Lynn. That's where I go back to. Oh, wow. Lynn Beach, Revere.
Yep.
Salem.
Yep.
The Black Picnic on Salem in July. All of it.
Awesome. Good. Is there anything, Keesha, from your father or your mother that was particularly instrumental in your life right now that you carry with you in the work that you do right now within democracy, democratic advocacy?
I mean, I think I've mentioned a couple things in terms of my understanding and orientation to what it means to fight. I think from my parents, there's always this idea that we're here to give of ourselves, not selflessly, right, but selfishly, understanding that we are deeply part of a networked and connected community, and that sense of self, that sense of purpose, is the anchor for that work. And because you can get consumed by it, right? It can be something that becomes an exercise in how much can I give? What can I do? This, that, and the other. And maybe the activity becomes the purpose as opposed to doing activity to achieve a purpose, understanding what you're doing, why you're doing it, where you're entering. And I think that's the thing I get from my parents. It's like the sense of self is just as important as a sense of community, because if you're not rooted in both, either one can carry you away. And I think we see examples of both, right? People are so rooted in community without a sense of self that they give and give and give until there's nothing, literally nothing left. Or folks who are very rooted in a sense of self but have no connective tissue to a broader system, community than themselves. And you see I think, a different kind of manifestation of those kind of balance. And I know I'm being reductionist by saying it's this or that. Most people exist upon a spectrum in all ways. But I think that's kind of the way I think those priorities for my parents landed for me.
Where do you find community these days?
It's very funny because my wife and I were having a whole question about where is our community? We've moved so much. I was born in Massachusetts. We moved to Virginia, then Michigan, then Minnesota, then Oklahoma, then back to Minnesota. I went to law school in Boston, moved back to Minnesota, then moved to New York. So the idea of community simply being a geography or a community in a place has always been a very narrow idea. You always have community where you are, but the people, the networks, these are all people you carry with you in your heart and in your practice and now in your cell phone. That the ability to navigate and carry community with you, I think, goes with you. And I'm so fortunate to be able to say I have community from everywhere, right? In this country, outside of this country, all kinds of spaces and places. It's the identity of the folks and how people come to it. And you can kind of tell their vibe. And, you kind of know them when you see them and you hold on to them. And so I'm very fortunate that I have my New York community, and these are friends from Harlem to Brooklyn, but still friends in Minneapolis. And community comes, I think, through and from active engagement. I think everyone I'm closest to with the exception of a couple folks from like college, and even then there were things we were doing, are connected through some sort of activity, engagement, what we've seen is important, and then said, yep, I want to stay in community with this person. I want this person to continue to be part of my life, part of our experience. And my wife and I had worried about maybe we had moved too much, maybe we don't have enough connection in place. And we're like, well, and so we're getting ready to move again. We haven't decided where. And it's been so funny that so many people from around the country are like, well, of course you're moving here, and of course you're moving there. And we were sitting here lamenting, like, do we have enough community where we're at? And it's like, there's people all over the country saying, come be with us, come be part of where we are. And so the ability to be able to identify folks, to be able to, it's just an incredible gift to be able to connect with people through all different experiences, walks of life, localities, all over the globe, frankly. That has been it's really incredible. So I guess I don't have a simple answer like, oh, I find community in church or I find community in this. But it's through all our actions and engagements. But I would say the one thing that's a consistent thread, it's almost entirely through people who we've engaged with activity, volunteering, values-based connections, or community work, like almost always. And those have been the relationships that have stuck.
As a Black professional in this space, I have always struggled to find a sense of not being the only or not being alone. And part of, again, why I started this podcast was because I was beginning to learn about individuals like you or others in the space of philanthropy who also identify as Black, as realizing, oh, there's others out there besides me. And so we again, many of our guests know and don't know about communities like ABFE, which is Association of Black Foundation Executives, or the African American Development Officers Association, F3. There's these institutions that have identified Black professionals in philanthropy as a way to connect. And so for many of us, that's how some of us are starting to find community, whether it's, again, through social media or through these organizations. And so I wonder for you, as you've transitioned through community organizing or community advocacy for voting rights, then into a more philanthropic sector of work, have you been able to keep the same community that you had when you were working more, it sounds like, more on the ground with individuals, as opposed to being then into a more philanthropic institution, if that question makes sense?
I think I maintain a lot of positive relationships with a lot of the folks that I was in community organizing with. Largely, those were folks 1,500 miles away. So I'm not going to say it's like, oh, we still kick it the way we used to, right? That's not reasonable. But the community, I think, with philanthropy, there has been places like AbbVie and some of the amazing work that they do that really stand up the framework and the scaffolding for people to connect and network on the broader level of being Black in philanthropy. And you name a lot of the things that in a lot of places, people are one of very few, one of one, one of two, but they're very few, particularly even in larger institutions where Black folks show up in program staff looks very different than across the institution, across the philanthropic institutions. So on the programmatic side, there's still fewer of us. That being said, I think that a lot of relationship was also being able to build through, frankly, connection through like pooled funds and some of the affinity groups and PSOs, where I think even within those spaces, we continue, you continue to connect, find each other, build and grow relationships, right? I had the great opportunity to go to Bogota earlier this year to work on some futuring work with both philanthropy folks and practitioners. And even within that, there was a collection of sort of queer Black women who found each other, and we went out to dinner and we had a connection, and we still have a signal group that is still active from that meeting and from that conversation. Because I think when we get in these spaces, we see like travelers in the world. I think the one thing, to your point, when you're so used to being in so many places where you're the only one or the only types of spaces are very formal and structured, when you see fellow travelers, you seize upon that opportunity to create and connect their community. And I am incredibly fortunate to have a whole ecosystem of Black women in particular, but not entirely. When I think of Rodney or Jason or some of the folks I know you've had on this in this space, but who have been, real partners, real comrades, real, just been my girls throughout this process, and building that community. So I think a lot of it is taking advantage of some of the formal structures that you identify, but then when you find those people, you don't let them go. You connect and you continue to connect, and really see what's possible in the world.
One of the things that you talked about, some of the future work that you do, I want to give some context of why that really could matter for some of us right now, because we are now in the third quarter of this year, and what an interesting year it has been. Always a new surprise around the corner. And I think what I'm finding, or where I get a little nervous, is the ways in which the hopelessness that I sometimes find colleagues have regarding, regardless of the sector, that it's becoming normalized, that people are just, is bad out there. And there's like a shrugging of one's shoulders. And I think the challenge, I think, for many of us is then to find hope. Where do we find hope in all of this? Yes, we know the sky is actually falling. It's no longer a drill in many ways. I wonder for you, in the work that you do, where are you finding hope, and what does that look like for you to have hope?
My hope is in the people that keep striving, who look at the circumstances that you've identified and said, there's still possibility for this future. It's not blind hope. It's not blind optimism. It's not, and I think there is a distinction between sort of, blind, unreasoned optimism, and stepping out by faith, right? When you're stepping out by faith, you're stepping out with an understanding, again, that you're stepping into something, right? What do you have faith in? And who do I have faith in? Our people. I have faith in the communities, these same communities that have been striving to create a better way and a new future, have not stopped trying to do so, even in the face of all these things. And this is not me being Pollyanna, like I don't recognize the deep challenges and the utter violence that's being made on so many communities. That spiritual violence, individual violence, collective violence, police violence, all of these things are happening all over to everyone. And it is not the idea that says, despite that, we're going to make it. It is with the understanding that this is where we are in this moment. There is still a tomorrow we are striving towards. But I think it has to be intentional. And the faith that I have is not that we can continue to function in this this trauma, this way that we can be soaked in trauma, right? Where everyone's fighting so hard, everyone is, and people are being exhausted and worn out, and the mantra is just keep going, just keep fighting. We've always found a way. But really more of there is a future that we can design. And we can move into that design. It is not a question of life is just going to keep happening to you, right? That life doesn't have to happen to you. This is not hubris in like, well, we're going to change the future, or we can guess what it is. But we all know that there's a distinction between that. We know that the decisions we make today, our future is bound up in the decisions we make today, just as we recognize that where we sit today is intricately bound to decisions we made yesterday. And the future that we're seeking to see, what happens when we change our horizon from next week to next year, to 10 years from now, to 20 years from now, to a multi-generational broad perspective of how the choices we make create those opportunities for the future, how we make sure we're becoming more expansive, more sustainable, more equitable, stronger, more connected. Those are the kinds of things that involve affirmative choice, affirmative engagement. And these are choices. These are strategic choice points we can make. And the fact is, when we look all over the country, people are making those choice points. People are deciding that there's a future to be had and that they can engage with it and through it. And there are short-term strategies, long-term strategies, midterm strategies that are acknowledging and recognizing the context that we operate in. And we know it's tough. But there will be a tomorrow. The question is, how do we occupy that tomorrow? what becomes the possibilities. And so those are the kinds of things that I think of that are hopeful. It's not just, oh, I think technology is going to change everything. I mean, technology has its good and its bad. That we know there's different points of engagement around all these issues and all these demands that are coming from communities. And it is those same communities that I believe in. It is the scholars, it is the activists, it's the community connectors who continue every day to say there is a future I can be a part of, and I'm ready to build that future with like-minded travelers.
And the artists, I'll put ourselves
Artists,
in there
yes,
as well.
of course. The artists who translate all this stuff into something that is connected and real and strong. And the artists give voice to the vision, imagery, and heartbeat that's required for the future. And I think, and whether it's voice in terms of like literal voice, or whether it's through visual art, whether it's through writing, whether it's through whatever medium the artist chooses to give, the ability and the importance of our culture and the culture that is curated. You'll forgive me for not lifting that up first, but I know it's there. I know it's there.
Well, I just, as an artist, I think where I truly, that's where I get my hope from, is I get my hope from artists who are, for some reason, we get a pass. Currently, right now, we get a pass, and that we are able to pull an artist card. People, oh, that's just an artist. That's just an artist being an artist. But an artist can tell the truth and are able to disseminate the truth, a capital T truth, in many ways, in sneaky ways that, for which I'm grateful to be a part of that community. I'll speak for myself as someone who works in the enslaved narrative space, and how I'm able to help lift up firsthand accounts of those who experienced slavery as an artist, where people are surprised that they've just sat through someone's firsthand account of what it was like to have their children taken away, or what rape felt like, or what murder felt like, or what abuse and trauma, or what courage and faith felt like as an artist. So I am grateful for the scholars, for the artists, for the advocates in many ways in the spectrum who are continuing. Oftentimes, when people are trying to negotiate the circumstances that we are currently living in right now, present day in the U.S., and oftentimes when I ask about that question of hope, even our guest on this show, where do you get your hope from? Where does your hope come from? And the response is often, well, we've been here before. So, and there's sort of this thought, we've been here before, so therefore we can do it again. And I think, well, we've not been here before. Our ancestors were here before. And I don't see a lot of consistency in the way that people have shown up regarding and I'll go as far back as our enslaved ancestors, how they showed up on a daily basis versus how we show up on a daily basis. And I just often wonder if this sense of, well, we've been here before, so, well, no, we haven't. This country has been here before, but your mother had been here before, perhaps. Your grandfather had been here before, perhaps. But not us in 2025 who are like thinking about Instagram likes. Like, that's just a different way to maneuver the world. So I just wondered, from your perspective, if you share that sentiment, like, well, we've been here before, so we'll get through it again, or if something actually is different between the generations that were actually here before and where we are right now.
The idea that says things have been challenging in the past, things will continue to be challenging. The fact that things are difficult and challenging is not a reason to give up, and we can make it through. I think that's a perfectly reasonable tautology. However, I think your point is well taken. The we of this moment is not necessarily a shared lived experience, right? Is it the experience of our genes, of our relation, of our stories, of our family? Absolutely. And to not forget that, to not lose that connection is incredibly important. So one of the things, I know I have a story for everything, but here's another one. So one of the things we were able to do, Rockefeller Brothers Fund is a global foundation. So whereas my portfolio is focused on the United States, we have a Central America program, a Western Balkans program, China program, all doing amazing work around the globe. And our peace building and sustainable development programs are also global, and our democratic practice global challenges. So I am one of the few that is focused solely in the U.S. And we were able to partner with some amazing grantees from our Central America program. And I was able to pull together a number. We invited all of our US grantees to be in community online with our Central America program, program, a few selected grantees to talk about their experiences, to really kind of understand for folks who have operated under different kinds of governance and governance structures. Some of our US grantees have not really experienced those kinds of more heavy-handed governments, and operating and really trying to say, how do we connect folks, as you note, who have never operated in these types of governance structures, who have never operated this way, to connect them to folks who actually have, who work with Afro-Indigenous folks in Guatemala, who work with LGBTQ groups in Honduras, who work in spaces where it isn't easy to function, and what does it mean as it becomes more difficult to engage. And the one thing that was really interesting that came away from this, and other colleagues have said from other parts of the world where they've intentionally been in relationship with folks, is that one, the world is very concerned about the directionality of the United States itself, and that the world is not persuaded that Americans truly understand the level and degree of sacrifice that is required to actually fight some of the fights that are identified if we're going to make some deep shifts to be more supportive of community, to be more supportive of democracy, to ensure these kinds of interventions. And so there is no question, to your point, that we as a generation, as this collection of people wandering around the earth right now, have not been here before. And what the context where we're operating and what we're being called to do, depending upon what we're seeking to achieve, is going to be different and fundamentally different. To your point, we're operating in a different media environment. We're operating in a different environmental and climate environment. We're operating in a deeply different economic environment. And we're operating in a way where people are demanding different things from government, not just count my vote, right? But we want policies to be responsive, and we want them to be responsive quickly. We want them to show up in very real and important ways. And these demands are all creating context for where we have to function, in addition to really deep shifts in our relationship to our government and to governance practices that may demand different actions from folks. And I think we're seeing that idea that this is not, this is not the revolution of yesteryear, but the core principles of what we're striving for, what's possible, what we need, I think are laid out. But we do have to recognize, to your point, the past is translated through the vision of ourselves today in service of a different future. So it is not enough simply to say we've been here before, but what have we learned by being here before? How are we understanding it in the context where we function? And what then are the interventions we are engaging around to have the future we envision?
Well, that's the thing. It's the question that comes to mind. That's pretty much what you're saying is what's required of us, right? Based on the lessons that we've learned, what's required of how you show up today, of how I show up today. Our ancestors from along the spectrum of generations, it cost them something. And for many, it cost them their lives. It cost them their jobs. And the question that I often ask myself regarding our current generations, because we are a multi-generational community right now, is are we willing to are we willing to pay the costs? Whether that's through philanthropy, whether that's through our bodies, whether that's through showing up in certain ways or advocating on behalf of other communities and being a part of other communities in more integral ways. I think the challenge is, of course, is there's such a great disconnect because we're so stuck in social media and everything is virtual that going into someone's home, right? One of our colleagues, Brianna Rogers, who was a guest a couple of episodes ago, would say it doesn't smell so good, right? That sometimes doing the work of advocacy and community doesn't always taste good, doesn't smell good. It actually stinks sometimes because sometimes people are in positions where it does smell. So then are we willing to engage in actual real transformation for that community when that requires that we actually literally get dirty or get cut sometimes? So Keesha, we've talked a little bit about where your hope comes from, and your hope coming from the work that people are currently doing on the ground, and your confidence that that work will continue, that it's not just about what's happening today, but that there actually is a tomorrow that's going to come. We do know that. The question that I have for you relates to some of the future-oriented work that you do and that you focus on, and if there are any experiences that you can share with what that actual future-oriented work looks like.
So I've been really fortunate to have the opportunity to launch a project called Future Bound. And that is a whole project around the idea that we have to really embed futures and forecasting practices into our entire democratic ecosystem, whether it's organizing, whether it's our structural democracy work, what we're talking about. We're workshopping different language better than leadership development, because really what we're thinking about is the idea of, as leaders, for us to be effective in the future, we are going to have to challenge everything we know about what got us to this point. And that's a very difficult thing to do, right? Our identity is often tied up in like our expertise, what we know, how we do this, how we move forward. And the ability to be able to be flexible around that is actually a whole new area of development. It's a whole new area of exploration. It's about grieving and letting go of who we were in the past and celebrating where we're going, even though we don't know exactly what it looks like, and trying to figure out what that looks like without necessarily falling back on, we're going to do things this way because that's the way I understand them to be, or X person has funded me to do it in this kind of way. But the reality of saying there's a future out there that actually requires us to be different than the individuals, institutions, societies, and communities that got us here are not going to be the same individuals, societies, communities, and networks that get us to the next place if we want it to be something that is fundamentally built on equity, sustainability, responsibility, and all of these things that aren't necessarily driving ethos on where we are now. And so really trying to figure out what that work is. And so we're trying to call it something other than leadership development, because leadership development is kind of couched to this idea that you lead in a certain way. We're going to teach you how to be a thing. And we're actually in a whole process of unlearning, and saying, how do we support leaders in their unlearning and relearning into what's next? How do we cultivate leaders in a very, leaderful sounds a little trite, but the idea that we're in a space now where leadership has to be multinodal, the whole idea of a deep hierarchical, one triangular point of leadership that has a singular point of failure, doesn't feel like the way we should be thinking about what's next, and doesn't feel like that thing. And so what does that, how do we understand that? How do we grow into and through that? How dependent are these historical models of leadership on, white supremacy culture, on patriarchal models, and all these things that have led us to these corners around fossil, that have led us straight to, we've painted ourselves into so many corners by using so much of the ethos, framework, and paradigms that got us here. We have got to do better and feel differently about how we're doing what's next. And so much of the work of Future Bound is really about how do we actually operationalize that? What is the methodology of the what we call rootstock learning communities? And rootstock is just another name for rhizomes, which is another way of saying the way the learning communities want to work, or the way that rhizomes work and grow, which is that each stalk is a growth out of something that's before, and you end up with these entire ecosystems, and you can have an entire rhizomal forest, right, of things that are led and grow. And how do we do this by honoring diverse perspectives and all the things that go along with that? How do we connect that to, as I mentioned, the big the context for the ecosystem that we're operating within, and really having that deeply rooted. Because one of the challenges we've seen with future-oriented work is it's often this idea of like, let's take people out of place, throw them in a scenario conversation, and then tell them, say, oh, take that learning and go back to where you came. That didn't make a lot of sense to us. We really felt that people learn best about what's possible by dealing with and dealing through it in the communities where they actually function. So our work is in place. It's in the regions where people are happening, and grouping people in regions and giving people opportunity. The idea that our communities and the communities we care most about have the luxury of dealing with artificial scenarios and then applying them, I think is also false. We are actually dealing with and working through the actual challenges around climate, around the economy, around technological advances that people are actually dealing with, to really say, how do we reshape the future around that, as opposed to forcing people to extrapolate from different sort of models, but to actually dive straight directly into it and say, okay, how are we doing this? How are we building so it's not separate work and it's not separate ideas? And so we are super, super excited about that work and where that's going. And the future bound work is its own thing. And we have been very fortunate to be supported by colleagues in places like Democracy Fund, MacArthur Foundation, and others have said, actually, let's see where this work goes. And they've been really wonderful in supporting us moving those works. And as you mentioned, we had our first convening last week. But that also informs all of our grant making, right? That the idea of saying we have to think about what's next, not just where we were. And for someone who works in structural democracy, many of the ideas are like, you can go back 20, 25 years and textbooks, and having these conversations and these models are kind of the same. They haven't been pressure tested for the context that we're in. And we're working with some really great folks, Guy Charles in particular, and his team at the Charles Hamilton Houston for Race and Justice, on how do we really start examining these questions of the structures of our democracy under the kinds of pressures that are actually our contemporary reality, not simply saying, let's just adopt a model because it's a thing we've always known it to be, and that model's actually going to work, even though it has, like, how are we thinking about these things? So it's really incredible, the diversity of folks who have come in to really help partner and lead with this work, but then also very specifically, how does it inform us as philanthropists and people who make grants and are strategic about how we think about what's next? And that part, and being in community with different folks who are specifically trying to enter and answer these questions about innovations, and how are we innovative in thinking about what's possible as philanthropic professionals, while at the same time, honoring that tension and also recognizing we can talk about the future all day long. The vast majority of the work is the here and the now. Right? We've talked about the challenges. We've talked about this. So while you hear me talk about these things, I think sometimes people then go, you're not funding anything for today. I'm like, of course, of course. We're in the fight for today. We are looking at the opportunities and the strategies that people are presenting for the moments that we're in, for what we have to do, for what we have to respond. But we have to understand clearly, how does this rest in a forward vision? Otherwise, these wins are contemporaneous, but aren't rooted or informed by what's next. They're not connected to what we need to build that sustainable, equitable, the future that includes all of us. I think one of the challenges we frequently run into is people, and it's like, well, we talk about multiracial democracy, and people are like, well, that's not everybody. I'm like, no, multiracial does actually mean everybody. Right. It's not. I think people are so used to hearing and trying to find coded language that excludes people. The idea that we're actively working with language that is definitionally inclusive, and actually says everybody's got to work this out. Everybody's got to work this through. It is not enough to have segments or pieces or parts of the population. And I'm not saying this is, again, no one's singing Kumbaya around a campfire around everything in this moment. But the idea is the solutions that we arrive at cannot actively leave out huge segments of populations cannot actively not consider how people show up. We've seen what happens when people advance policies that aren't fully inclusive, do not consider how people are impacted. We see how destabilizing it is. We see how inequitable it is. We see how it actually denies a future for so many people. That it's not a future that that I want to be a part of. And I'm super honored that the grantees, the partners, and the friends in philanthropy that are moving towards that see that as broader goals.
What surprised you about the first convening?
Oh my gosh. The readiness of the field to be like, why are we still talking about this? Let's go.
Why did that surprise you?
It didn't surprise me in the sense that we knew people were ready. People were hungry for it. I expected more. I just expected more pushback in ways, not even around the ideas, but sort of like, why you, Keesha? Like, who are you showing up saying this and this, that, and the other? How are your team, this, that, and the other? But I'm very fortunate that the team that we've gathered, everything from our project manager, Insay Ufat, all the way to Arendelle McClellan and Jessica Pierce and Brian Perlmutter. And there's a whole bunch of names in here that for people who know, they know, and that these are incredible leaders that are really connected and really important to this work. And that brought a lot of their validity to the process. But people were ready. They were ready to stand in partnership. They were ready, and I think that they saw that we respected them, their work, their contribution, and were really reliant upon their vision and their intervention. This wasn't just an exercise and like, come show up to this meeting and the experts are going to tell you what to do and you have to figure out like, are we going to take this money or not because is it any good or is it not? But really saying, well, we're building this together. It is about creating agency, creating designers of the future by creating agents and agency in the organizations. And people got it. They got it fast. It was exciting. It was tantalizing to people. And the idea of being in community, people really wanted to make sure this community holds and continues to grow. So I think I was surprised, and I probably shouldn't have been. I expected more. I expected, and don't get me wrong, I think there was definitely a rigor. There were a lot of hard questions about theory of change and why this and why now. Really, really sharp folks that were really like, who I think put us to our test, but I think we passed, right? And once that happened, we're starting to move forward. Is the work done in building and maintaining this community? Absolutely not. But it was really, really exciting to see how many people. I was also really thrilled to see the range, like people who are 19 and 70 in the same room being ready to share this vision. The multidisciplinary nature of it, we didn't say just democracy people or just enviro people. And so we had housing, racial equity, folks that were born out of Katrina, folks who were doing primarily immigration work, all seeing this shared vision. And so it was really, that part was incredibly exciting as well.
So one of the things that you said, Keesha, about future-oriented work and part of the process of doing future-oriented work is the sense of grieving what was and the reality of what got us to the point of where we are right now. We're not here by accident. We're here by choices. And that life is not happening to us, right? That we're actually active participants in what's happening. So can you talk a little bit about what a grieving process looks like in some of the work that you do that's future-oriented?
This is an area we're really starting to explore, but we just see it as being incredibly important. And the way we're thinking about it really, like we said, had to do with the idea that some of the toughest work out there is identity work, right? That when you're asking people to do things differently, when you're asking people to change, I worked, and I'm proud to say I'm still affiliated with, I said, the National Board for Legal Women Voters. This is one of the longest, most stable membership organizations this country has seen, alongside with NAA, alongside with other places that have that same sort of pedigree and history. And one of the challenges that we see in these spaces is when you ask people to do things differently, they don't necessarily just hear, we want to do things differently, but that you, who hold this identity as, chapter president of, this county, in Missouri and you've been in this role and we come and we say, oh gosh, we want to do things differently. People don't just hear, oh, this is my chance to like do something different and change and lead in a different. They oftentimes hear you're doing something wrong. You are wrong, right? They're so closely tied, not just to the identity of that role, but to how we do things and things like that. And so allowing people to say, yeah, this is how we've done it. And this is how it worked. And this is how it has worked. And by doing something differently, I have to let go of what I know to be true. Because much of what we know to be true is based upon the context of what was. And so being able to say, I want to move through a new place. I want to learn new things. I want to bring my leadership to a different space, maybe with the same people, right? With the same goals, but understanding the activities and actions, what we know can be different, must be different. There's a grief that attaches to that. There's a loss. It isn't just, oh, try something new. It's okay. It's scary. People will do a whole lot just to avoid scary things, to avoid feelings, right? And what we're saying is, in many ways, there's no feelings you have to be afraid of. And we're going to be in community facing these things together. But there's always going to be individual work to be able to say, this is hard. This is who I built myself to be. I've been doing this 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, 50 years, all these different communities. But the fact that we had people who were 70 years old in this room saying, I've been doing this and striving and I'm ready to push into someplace new tells me that this is not an age-related function. This is a function of openness. This is a function of vision. This is a function of bravery. This is a function of desire. But it's not a function of simply old dogs and new tricks. There are young people who are just as attached to the very things that gave them, like if you're letting go of the things that gave you credibility, right? You've got to be able to say, I can do that. And there is a grief with that. And there's a grieving with that. And we recognize that that's part of leadership. And that's part of the next phase of leadership. And we want that to be part of our offerings and learnings and engagement as we move through this work.
Many of our listeners are nonprofits. Some of them are fundraisers who work for nonprofits, of course. I'm also a fundraiser, and I worked for many a nonprofit. And as fundraisers, we're just so focused on getting money, making sure that we have funds for the operating budget or for our capital campaign or for our film project or whatever it might be. And that we can be so transaction oriented and so truly dollar oriented. Like if nothing else happened from that meeting that I just had with that prospective donor, if I just got a check, then we can all agree that it went well. And we've spoken previously that is not always the case, that just because someone wrote you a check, that may or may not be the right thing for a community. And that's very foreign to boards and to development offices and to EDs who are just like, we just need to look at the P&L statement and figure out how we're going to work through this. So can you help our listeners, as someone who's on the funding side, can you help our listeners understand why not every check is the right thing for a community?
The way I've said in the past is not all money's good money. Obviously, I didn't write that, but I think it's important to think about what does it mean to receive those dollars? What are the requirements that are attached to them? Sometimes just the requirements themselves can be too burdensome. If you're a small team and you're a small shop and there's this enormous list of requirements and you're like, this doesn't make sense for us, it's okay to say no. It's okay to say, actually, this isn't a good relationship for us at this time. That's actually a pretty good tool, right? Remembering that in philanthropy, our whole job is to give away money. And it imbues this sector with just an asymmetry of power. And it it can pervert relationships in sometimes really negative ways. And so the ability to be able to say no, but you really have to be standing in a clear understanding of what your organizational needs are. Because we've seen I've seen community groups that were largely driven by like volunteer energy, right? Who then say, oh, we're going to become a C3 and this, that, and the other. Now, all of a sudden you've got an executive director that's got to get paid and like 3 or 4 other people. And the nature and kind of the work changes. Who served in the community changes. Where the money goes first changes. Not every business structure and a 501c3 is a business model. It is a business. C3 is a tax designation, folks. It's not a business plan. These operations still have to function as businesses. And your business purpose has to be at least aligned with the sources of money that you receive to operate, or you're going to be pulled off mission. Now, you can make a decision that that's okay, right? But understanding that that's a reality and that it's not just every dollar that comes in the door is going to translate into something meaningful. And sometimes it can be really detrimental. And so the power to say no is as important as the check writer, as the donor saying yes. And it really does matter for the institutions and the folks that are doing this work to have the power to say no as well as yes when we're working around these missions. Because I'm going to say this, I've said this before, philanthropy is not a set of liberatory institutions. If your mission is about liberation, there's going to be a limit to what philanthropic dollars can do for you to achieve your goals. Every organization that has liberation as their goal, and sometimes even public service, sometimes political organizations, but there has to be a point when you have to determine where are your resources and where's your resourcing from? How much of your resourcing is, to your point, people power? How many people really understand what they need? I mean, that is, it's an incredible source of power. And I think something that's been deeply undermined by our sole focus on generating dollars. I do believe that a lot of the C3 ecosystem, advocacy and organizing, in some ways has underutilized and under-recognized the force and the power of people in some ways, in service of trying to raise a dollar. I know for someone raising money, someone working in philanthropy, it can sound very hollow to say money isn't everything. I'm not being flip and I'm not being obtuse. It is easy to say money isn't everything. I remember what it was like to be sitting there crossing your fingers to get a grant in the door because your payroll supports not just you, not just your team, but 3 kids over here and someone else. At one point, I remember shaking loose and realizing my ability to raise money, I think there were at least 2 heads of household that were directly employed, and I'm like, raising this money means somebody else's kids can eat who have put their faith and belief in the mission of the organization, in my leadership and our partnerships and all these things. And so, yeah, you don't sleep a lot. And you're up and you're writing the emails and you're doing the work. So please do not hear me say or make light of the fact that raising dollars is incredibly important to get the work done. But we do reach some points when we're saying, are these funds going to get us to where we need to go? Are there different ways of raising money? Are there different sources? And how much is required to build some of that into our future visioning and the visioning of our organizations as we think about what's possible if we're truly going to be leaning into a liberatory future?
It can be trite to say it's sort of transaction versus relationships, right? That it's very difficult to have a relationship as an institution or a nonprofit to have a relationship with a funder that's not aligned with values, right? So ultimately, if one is chasing dollars, and we've all been in a position with nonprofits who are chasing dollars, then you're going to always be chasing dollars. If you're only thinking about your payroll this month, then you're always going to be thinking about payroll next month, instead of what is our long-term plan? What's our long-term strategy? To your point regarding being future-oriented, what does this mean for us next year, 5 years from now, 10 years from now? And for many of us, myself included, are like, I don't have time for next year. I only have time for right now and to be focused on what's happening right now. But because I'm only focused on right now, then next year I'm in a bind. And so part of, I think, what you're asking for all of us who have sought funding is that you've got to think beyond this dollar and beyond this year so that you're a sustainable institution, again, 5 years from now, 10 years from now. Or, again, as they often say, nonprofits should be putting themselves out of business. Maybe you don't need to be keeping on doing this thing for the next 5 or 10 years. Hopefully you solve the problem. But I think part of what you're doing is empowering people to understand that in order for any institution, nonprofit, to be sustainable, it has to be relationship oriented, because you're going to need someone beyond your first, your 1 or your 2 or your 3 or your 4 donors. Because if you're only desperate for that one person to give, it's like, well, now you're in a bind. And I will say, part of the reason why some of our organizations right now are in the bind that they're losing their federal funding, is because they only had one funder, or they only had 2 funders, and one of those funders, with no advance warning, just walked away. And we all know in business, you can't have one funder. You can't have one client. You can't have one customer. You've got to make sure that you have this cycle's not the right word that I'm looking for, but you have a pipeline, a good old-fashioned sales, right? You have a pipeline. Right?
There's a structural and systemic value to diversity, right? And that shows up all across every system.
Right.
Right. And so as much as people want to, and even Supreme Court justices who say they don't understand what diversity means, I bet they do when they talk about their investment portfolio. Everyone does understand it. The fact is that is the diversity of sources, resources, the diversity of members, the diversity of these things all are about, those all create greater resiliency, create redundancy, and create opportunity. And whether you leverage that into actual inclusive activities that lead to more equitable outcomes, those are decisions that are made. Those are programmatic decisions, those are interventional decisions. But the fact is, if you're not thinking about those questions, those issues, it is definitionally detrimental. And it feels unfair. I remember when I was a kid, my dad, I'd say, it's not fair. And my dad looked at me and he's like, ain't nothing fair. He's like, I've seen a job fair. I've seen a county fair. I have never seen life be fair. And that's not what we're striving for. And we have to understand that what we're looking for is fairness in how we deal with folks, but we know everything's not going to be equitable. We know that's not. And if you want to change the behavior, remembering, philanthropic institutions are in the business of giving money away. If somebody looks at you and says, the way you give money, your patterns, your practices, your expectations around reporting, your expectations is actually too cumbersome for us as an institution. That is said so rarely, it speaks really loudly when it happens. There actually really are. That is actually a self-advocacy strategy. Again, I'm not confused. You can't do that with everybody. But there are certainly times when I've had grantees and partners in the field say, given how much money this is and how much work it is and this, that, and the other, we're just going to say no. It's just not worth it for us, what you're asking from us. And so some of it is just a matter of operation. What do people demand when giving money? What is all the things that are attached to it? And some of it is a deep misalignment in values. And these questions become harder and harder as there's more zeros attached. There's no question. But there is just a reality that the resources for your work don't either come through the communities that you're working with, i.e. membership or something like that. If they're not with deeply aligned folks, there will come a point when the work you're doing will become misaligned with the donors. It just will. it's maybe not today and maybe not tomorrow thing, but it's just something to be conscious of, that there are limitations to this being a soul way. And some of that can be satisfied by saying, this is a point we're going to get to with this work, and then we're done. And then we're going to reform into something else that's going to meet the needs of that time in that moment, and we're going to reassess. Other folks do it all kinds of different ways, but there's just a reality to recognizing that the donor class, for the most part, unless they actually come from the communities that people are seeking to change, are oftentimes have a misaligned interest or sometimes understanding of the problems we're seeking to solve. And some are better than others. Some are amazing. Some are incredibly rich and really good at it. And some are live much closer to the problems, and sometimes still don't get it very well. Again, this is not necessarily a positionality question. It is a matter of ethos. It's a matter of engagement and the reality of how our largely there's the system that is operated and runs around capitalism is going, how people who have that kind of wealth and enough wealth to give are going to be oriented to the work. But many people of means are also people of conscience. And this is not, again, it's not sweeping everything with a broad brush, but there's just a recognition that many of the systems and institutions that are ones we leverage when we advocate and ones we are in partnership with are the very same systems that are going to have to change, the very same institutions that are going to have to give for us to achieve the future we're seeking. And we have to hold all these things at once.
Are you proud of yourself, Keesha, at this point in your career?
I am proud of the things that I have supported and been able to accomplish. I am proud of the relationships that I've built. And I feel as evidence, I feel okay about being proud of those things because of the types of people who stand with me and stand in my corner. Because I recognize who they are. And to see that reflected back in them saying, we're standing with you and we're going to do this work together, that is what allows me to be proud of the work that I've done. I don't think I'm quite finished yet, though. I think there's more.
Well, we're here to support you in any way that we can. Our listeners, our communities, we're proud of you. We're proud of the work that you do, the work that you continue to do, the work that you have done. And thank you for showing up. Thank you for your hope. Thank you for being someone who is future oriented. Thank you for helping our listeners find a way to say no and find power in being able to say no. Thank you for helping our listeners grieve and know that it's okay to make mistakes. It's okay to acknowledge this is why we're here. This is how we've gotten here. This is what needs to change for us to get to a better place. What do you think is the best way for those who want to connect with you, Keesha?
Best way is probably email, but the fastest way is probably LinkedIn. I'm very easy to find and I do respond. I'm not always fast, but I do always respond to messages. Messages on LinkedIn. I made the mistake the other day of saying to my wife, it's like, slide into my DM. She's like, do not say that. That's not the right expression. So I'm still working on the lingo of all the spaces. But I would say message me directly on LinkedIn or email directly through the RBF website are probably the two most public and fastest ways to get in touch. So my email is my name, Gaskins-Nathan @rbf.org.
Keesha, as I say, we're very grateful for you. Thank you for trusting us to help share your story with our community. Thank you to our listeners for trusting Keesha and I with your time today. Neither she nor I take that time for granted. Keesha, anything you want to say before we scram today?
Thank you. Thank you for your time. Thank you to the listeners for taking their time. Really excited to be part of this conversation. It meant a lot. And I look forward to the next time our paths cross.